So today on Learning Unboxed, we are going to talk about creating brave spaces. And this is a topic that I've been super excited to be able to have a conversation about because it's so critically important in what's happening in classrooms and schools and communities today. And joining us for this conversation is Dr. Melissa Crum. So welcome, Melissa.
Thank you for having me.
Perfect. And so for a little bit of background and sort of context for our listeners, Dr. Crum is an artist, an author, a researcher, and the founder of Mosaic Education Network. And she leads a consulting company that infuses the arts, research, and storytelling and critical thinking into professional development, community building, and curriculum development. So again, Melissa, we are super excited to have you on the program and to sort of get us started today because our listeners come to us from all over the world, from a variety of different backgrounds and educational experiences and opportunities. So let's sort of set the stage first and foremost by explaining to us exactly what Mosaic Education Network is and sort of the why you created it, because we've had a lot of founders on this show, and it's one of my favorite topics. So why did you do this thing?
Yeah. Oh, okay. There's a story behind that. So
Always.
So I'll start with I began wanting to be a digital animator.
Oh, wow.
I did, yeah. And I started an animation program, and we had the opportunity to work with DreamWorks, which was really exciting. And they screened, when they came to teach us for that year, they screened Shark's Tale. And I don't know if you're familiar with this. I want to say it came out in it was early 2000s.
Yeah, but anyway, like that. Yeah.
Yeah, so Shark's Tale is set under the ocean, and everybody is an animal, right? Yeah. But when I watched it, I realized that the animals were racialized. I didn't have language for this. I just knew that you knew what the race or the ethnicity were of the animals without actually seeing them. And so Oscar was the protagonist, if you will. He was voiced by Will Smith. So if you know who Will Smith is, then you know Will Smith is African American. But Oscar we're supposed to see him as Black because he cites this Wu-Tang lyric, which if you know Wu-Tang is hip hop, and he has this gold chain and he does this thing. And then the henchmen were, which were the antagonists. They were jellyfish, but they had these Jamaican accents.
That's right. I remember that. So there was
this, and then you had this whole Godfather theme with the sharks that was stereotypical Italian. Yeah. But then Lenny didn't want to be a shark. He wanted to be a dolphin. So I found that there was there's this race thing happening, and there's these trans narratives that were happening. And I was like, this feels not accurate. I feel like there's something wrong here. I didn't have the language for that. And
it didn't feel okay to you in that moment.
It didn't feel okay to me, and nobody else.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up because, I saw it, and I'm certain of being kind of quasi-aware in that moment, but I don't know that any of you we don't dig into that, and we should.
Absolutely. And I just didn't have the words or the language. And I was in my program, and essentially I was like, I want to figure out who goes through this process of determining that we're going to lean on these stereotypes.
Right.
And my program was more so interested. They're like, we don't really care about that. We just care about you. We don't care about you asking why this fish has a gold chain. We're interested in you making that gold chain as realistic as possible.
As an animator, and not and not get in the weeds of the politics or the understanding of the social implications of the work that you're doing. They were asking you to not care about those other pieces.
It's we don't care.
That had to be really hard.
They didn't say it in that way, but essentially that's what they meant. So much that at the time, the chair of the department, laughed me out of his office. It was not great. Anyway, it was not a great experience. And then the person who said they were my advisor was like, I'm not really your advisor. And so I ended up getting removed from the program. And so they said, you just need to go to African Studies. And I was like, okay, that's not really what I came here for, but that's cool. And so when I went to African Studies, and to start a master's program, I was really disheveled, if you will. Like, I was like, nobody has language. Nobody seems to know what I'm talking about. And so then I go to the department. They're like, oh yeah, this has been going on for a while. People have been writing books about the role of animation and how that shaped how we misunderstand or understand different groups of people. And I felt like, oh, I'm home. Like, you all know.
So there was a win at the end of this experience for you.
Yes. And so I got my master's in African Studies, and I did my thesis on the role of animation and how that shaped how we have created narratives for different groups of people. And the thing is, these narratives are so powerful, we believe them and we have an investment in them, even if we actually haven't met these people, right? And so I then moved from there to get my doctorate in art education. And so I was really interested in thinking about the role of art and how to shape curriculum, how to help us think more deeply about how we understand ourselves and each other. And doing that work, I realized that I could be helping create curriculum for teachers, which is what I was really thinking about, community-based curriculum. Or I can really shift to help people think about how to be better teachers. Like, how do I help you think reflectively, like really think about why are you making these choices in your curriculum? Why are you making these choices in your classroom? So it's not just curriculum. We're seeing how these stories that we read from around our students lean into or impact our disciplinary action, our choices, choose who we say needs to go to special education or doesn't, who goes to gifted programs or not. Like, especially gifted programs is such for many places, such a subjective process, right?
Correct.
If you don't have a teacher or a parent advocating for you, then you may not even get recommended to those places.
Right.
And so, but if we're reading from a particular narrative that, oh, this student probably wouldn't be successful or whatever it might be, then we continue to perpetuate certain kinds of not only stereotypes, but patterns that don't necessarily include all our students. And so then I was working with teachers using the museum. So using art, using all these different spaces to think through these narratives. And then folks would then ask, well, can you come to my nonprofit? Can you come to my company? Still using these different things. And I was like, of course.
You're like, wow, okay, here's the space for this to all fit together. Yeah.
Right. And so it's like the same way these narratives about what does it mean to be a woman? What do I understand it means to be Black? What do I understand it means to be immigrant? Whatever those stories are, the same way they show up in our classroom around disciplinary actions or how we engage or disengage is similar when we go into a corporate setting, when we're talking about performance reviews and we're talking about hiring language, like who's the cultural fit, which is awful. Never use that phrase. Right. Because you're essentially saying who are the people that are like us. Right. And those are the people who need to bring. And then you're wondering why your space isn't diverse or inclusive.
Yeah.
And so even though the kind of process shifts a little bit, it's still the same. We're operating from narratives that we're not critically thinking about and editing along the way as we evolve as people and as we learn more.
Right. Wow. That is a awesome origin story. And what I love about it, right, let's put my anthropology hat on here. What I love about this origin story is it has all the different components that we sort of need to say that not only is it an engaged journey, but it's a journey that's going to have impact further down the road, even the pieces of the journey that haven't happened yet. So that's that sort of the classic components that are necessary to make all of the soup work, right? So that you actually want to partake. So that's awesome. And I had no idea. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate that you started this conversation talking about Shark Tales, and hopefully, DreamWorks doesn't get all twitchy on us, but we'll cross that bridge when it comes, because, I think, once you started that piece of the conversation, I started thinking about all of the animated programs that I watched or my kids watched, right? It's like, oh my gosh.
So this is a story. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, but wow, it's everywhere.
It is. And the thing is how do we help? We talk about like helping students and ways in which we kind of limit our children from seeing certain things, which there's definitely some things we probably shouldn't let our kids see.
Yeah, yeah.
But some of the other things are branded as child or for young people, but it still can feed into problematic narratives. For example, one story I like to share in my workshops is around my love for Disney movies. Like I love Disney movies. My brother and I would watch. So the movies were Jungle Book, Lion King, and Aladdin, and we would have the VHS tapes. You know I don't know.
Oh yeah. Oh, I do. Yeah, totally. Yeah.
We had to get the ones in the plastic case.
Yeah. No, I was that same kid, right? The same era where that's how you got your movies. Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. From video store. Yeah.
And my brother would want to plug it into VHS every day after school. So we love these Disney movies, but what also came with my love of Disney movies was a fear of people with British accents. I thought they were coming to get me. I thought I was nervous. I was scared. They were coming out the bushes.
Yeah.
And so after doing this kind of self-reflective work in this process that I support folks going through is like, where did that come from? And really, when I dig into my favorite child, focused stories, all of the villains in my favorite movies had British accents.
Interesting.
So like Scar has a British accent in the middle of the Serengeti. Why does he have a British accent? Shere Khan has a British accent in the middle of India. Like, why is that? Jafar has a British accent in what would be maybe Saudi Arabia. And so we can say that Disney was trying to help us understand like colonization and how the British Empire was taking over the world. That's not what they were doing. Essentially, they were saying that people who don't sound like you are the villains. And that's essentially what I took. That people who don't sound like me mean me harm. And the people who do sound like me are the heroes, because Simba, Aladdin, Mowgli all have American accents. And we don't think about American accent as an accent. We just think that it's
right. Yeah.
But no, it's an accent.
It is. Yeah, absolutely. No question. Yeah. Ask anybody not from the US, right?
Oh, you have American accents. I have an accent. No, you do. You have an American accent. And so none of these stories are located in America or in Britain.
Right.
And so there's an underlying narrative that's ultimately being shared with us. Now, I'm not saying I'm anti-Lion King or Jungle Book or any of those things, but what I am saying is we have to be cognizant of the stories that we're taking in, because whether we realize it or not, we're adding to our essay of who we understand or misunderstand people to be. And if we're not aware of, wait a minute, what am I taking from this? Whatever the story we're watching, whatever the TV show we're watching, whatever the book that we're reading, is that we have to have that filter on and be aware, because that information gets added to our story, which ultimately means it helps to shape the actions that we take in response to those folks. Because the funny thing is that fear of people with British accent, all that happened with me never, ever meeting someone from Britain.
Wow. That's
right.
Yeah.
And so I have this fear of someone I've never met in a place that I've never been, that I couldn't even tell you anything about, but somehow I was scared of them. Like, how does that show up when we think about ethnicity and race and other things? How have we been taught indirectly many times? Because it's not like my mother or my dad or anybody was like, don't trust those British folks. Nobody said that.
No one said that, right?
And the reason I think is really important for us to really be thinking about our stories is because, as I said, they're connected to our actions, but even more importantly, they're connected to our level of power. So like, imagine I have this fear of British accent, and now I rise to a place of power where I determine immigration laws. Or I rise to a position of power where I'm controlling curriculum. And now we don't talk about anything that deals with Britain because they're terrible people, or whatever it might be, even whether I say it overtly or covertly. If I still have this story that I've never critiqued since the age of 10 about people with British accents, and I rise to whatever level of power that I am, I'm still operating from that story.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that becomes really important for us to think about. This isn't minor. And we have to always do that kind of internal work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. This is one of the most fascinating conversations I've gotten to have in a really long time. So I want to start by saying, oh my gosh, awesome, loving it. But I do, before we go on to talking about sort of the brave spaces concept as part of your work, I want to ask a clarifying question, because I think that folks will be really intrigued by the conversation that we're having. And I just want to be super, super clear. So here's my question, and you'll understand the reason I'm asking as we sort of go through it. So can we effectively, right, tell or share these stories, right? So this fictional narrative based on elements of reality, can we do that without stereotyping?
So
and you know what I'm asking, right?
Right. Tell me.
Well, I mean, the reality of it is, right, so to go back to the way you started the conversation, right, with Shark Tales, right? And so could we have made the Will Smith character with it not have being Will Smith, right? Could we have a completely different affectation? And would that different affectation also have been a stereotype?
This is the thing. The tricky thing about stereotypes is that they're all a little bit true.
Exactly.
And the problem is that we stick to the little bit.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's where the problem comes in. So Will Smith is, in fact, a hip hop artist, right? Yeah. At least at one point, right? Yeah. So to have Oscar visually have some connection to that, kind of almost like we can see where the through line is, but he also was not a hip hop artist in the movie,
right?
You know what I'm saying? Like, so then it's like, wait a minute, what are we doing here? So like, or the jellyfish. The henchmen. So yes, it's possible to have this kind of Jamaican accent, but we're also relegating them in this particular kind of, they're very flat characters.
Yeah, exactly.
And so what does ultimately does that mean? So I think the problem when we're writing stories and everybody can't be a round character, right? We only do that through series. So some people have to be flat characters, but in their flatness, are we pulling from stereotypes? And that's where the question comes in, because those henchmen could have had any accent. They could have just they're from Wisconsin. They could have been any but they chose a particular kind, so why are we pulling in that kind of way? And I think that's where the question comes in. I don't think we can fully get away from stereotypes. The question is, are we making those people complex? Right. Are we essentially honoring their full humanity outside this limited scope that we're providing for them?
I love that. And that's the perfect way, I think, to phrase that. So thank you so much for that. Absolutely. So then let's bring this full circle and talk about the work that you're engaged in now, which is around brave spaces. And I can see the connection between that early experience and the founding of this organization and the work that you're engaged in now. So for our listeners, sort of what are you talking about when you say that, we need to be creating brave spaces? What does that mean?
Yeah. So many people talk about safe spaces.
Right.
And safe spaces implies that we're going to have this honest, robust conversation. We get to say what we feel and we say what's on our hearts, and everybody's going to have a great time and everybody's going to leave the conversation feeling amazing. That oftentimes does not happen.
Correct. It's not true. It's a false narrative, right? It's a false expectation too, right? We set it up to be this thing, and we may actually believe in the moment we're having that, but we walk away from it with something completely different typically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So when we're having difficult conversations, I don't think it's possible to have a safe space. I think safe spaces for me are likely relegated to areas where someone has a duty of care specifically, right? So a counselor, something like that, where it's their job to create the container, and it's more focused on the person who is in need of the care. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, to me, it's like if you're in a duty of care, then that you are required to have this safe space for someone to be vulnerable so that you can support them in whatever that path is. But when we're talking about people who are peers, we're talking about people who are trying to have a conversation when they're in a shared power position, right? At least in the conversation, is no one has a full duty of care for the other person in the absence of their care, right? So if I'm having a duty of care, like as a counselor, yes, I need to be aware of how I'm being treated in this conversation, but really my focus is on you.
Right.
So when we're in tough conversations where we're both coming to this space equally, what I believe is that there's a good chance that someone's feelings are going to get hurt. Right. Someone is going to feel uncomfortable. Someone is not going to like the way this conversation is going. And so Brave Space is saying that we may enter this conversation and I might not say the right thing. Mm-hmm. You might not say the right thing, but we're going to believe that we're coming to this conversation with positive intent, that we're using the best language that we have right now, the highest level of consciousness that we have right now, and that may not be enough for you.
Interesting.
And so recognizing when someone says the wrong thing, right, mm-hmm. that we then say, okay, I'm going to believe that you're coming to this conversation with positive intent. And I'm going to also say to you, hey, that thing you just said was hurtful. Mm-hmm. Can you consider this other language, or can you consider this other perspective? And I'm going to believe you're going to come to a space with positive intent until you show me that you're actually here for harm. And then then we shift, right?
Then it's a whole nother experience and conversation, right? Yeah.
But I would argue that many times people are simply operating from their level of consciousness, which may not be high enough for you. Right. And so that means, how do we continue to engage in this conversation with respect and accountability? Mm-hmm. So that doesn't mean you get to say anything you want to say, because we get to call each other out on these things. But again, believing that we are trying to get to some location of either understanding, of a greater awareness, whatever that might be. But what people tend to do when they say a place is safe is that once the moment they get uncomfortable, they're ready to leave. Right. And a Brave Space says, no, we're sticking in this. We're sticking in this, and we're going to figure out how to continue this conversation in a way that we can still engage in this productive way. So one thing I like to give folks this visual. Imagine that we were like in the forest, there's all these trees and we're going hiking. And then we see this big 8-foot bear that stands up and starts growling, right? Our bodies are going to do a couple of things. It's going to do this flight, fight, or freeze, which we've heard, right? And so we're going to try and fight the bear. Good luck with that.
Not a good choice.
We're going to freeze, which may also not be great.
Yeah.
Or we're going to flee, right? We're going to run.
Right.
So that thing that happens in our bodies when we see this bear is the exact same thing that happens when we're in a difficult conversation where someone is ultimately challenging our worldview and how we understand ourselves. So if I'm saying to you, hey, this thing that you just said, or this perspective that you said is really harmful to trans people, or it's really harmful when we're thinking about immigration, or it's really harmful when we're thinking about a state-sanctioned violence and how that disproportionately harms Black and Indigenous folks. Mm-hmm. Like the way you're talking about this is really harmful. And so for some person who's never really thought about how they've considered maybe the role of race or identity or something, it can feel like a bear. I've just brought a bear to this conversation.
Right.
And so you want to either fight, so that means getting defensive. Well, that's not what I mean. I have Black friends or whatever people say, like when they're getting defensive. Or they freeze, they shut down, they cross their arms, they're silent. I'm fine, right? We've heard that.
Yeah.
Or you flee, they leave the conversation. They're like, well, I don't, you're being rude. I don't want to do this. And then they leave. And so what Brave Space is saying is the bear is not there. You have to tell yourself the bear isn't there. You're just having a difficult conversation. So stick in it. And so we can't really do the work of addressing so much of the challenges that aren't new. It may feel new to some folks. The challenges aren't new unless we really stick through these kind of difficult conversations and be self-aware that, oh, I feel that this is a bear, but it's really not. And really telling yourself that so you can stick in it. And sometimes that means in the conversation saying like, wait a minute, can you give me like a minute to breathe? I tell people, you know what, the way to get the bear out is to breathe. Like take some deep breaths and then say, give me a second, and then get back into it.
Stick to and be present for the whole conversation. Absolutely. So then, Melissa, how does this translate into crafting or creating a school, a community center, a classroom into a brave space? And I'm not trying to take away from the work or the workshops that you do, recognizing, but I can imagine folks sitting here listening to this saying, oh my gosh, this is the missing piece, because if you think about over the last, say 5, even 10 years, right, the sort of transitional sort of components that have been tossed at schools around rethinking the way that they are engaging in creating, and I'm going to use a safe space for the moment, right? Because that's where a lot of the conversation around schools have been. I'm going to create a whole different way to think about discipline, a whole different way to think about, conflict resolution within my own classrooms, right? And yet what we're talking about here is taking that one step further, right? And so what are some of those sort of tangible, low-hanging fruit sort of pieces that if I'm a teacher and I want to shift from a safe space, which is what my school's been advocating for many years, to a brave space, what is it that I should be doing, or how should I be thinking about that? And again, not to take away from the bigger, broader work that you're doing. So not to give away all of the hidden secrets inside of the way that you walk folks through the process, but what should an individual classroom teacher, for example, be thinking about as it relates to brave space versus just safe space? And I know we talked about the difference between the two, but this is nuts and bolts sort of moment. I'm a 3rd grade teacher, in a community that may or may not be embracing the sort of change that I want to see happening in my classroom. So how do I get there?
Yeah. So I like to tell folks that change starts with you. So you start thinking about what is in your sphere of influence. You might not be able to shift the disciplinary practices and the choices and everything that from the broader school or district or whatever, but what can you shift? And one thing that you can shift is what is your level of vulnerability within the classroom?
Right.
So something that can be as simple, it sounds simple, but for many people it's very difficult. It's saying like when you're wrong.
Right.
Like it can be very difficult for teachers to say to students, especially, well, it don't even matter whether they're 3rd graders or they're
high school. Yeah.
High school, to say, you know what? I told y'all that homework was due last week and I just told you it was due today and that's wrong. Like I messed up.
Yeah.
Or I said I was going to do this and I didn't do that. That's my fault. Right. So part of a brave space requires vulnerability. Like when I said, I'm feeling this bear, I need a moment to breathe. That's vulnerable. I'm telling you, this is very difficult for me. Yeah. So practicing that vulnerability, which also helps students to be able to do the same. And so that vulnerability, we can see that with students when they do something wrong, when they've caused harm to another student, or they didn't turn their homework in, whatever it might be. Or if you're talking about shifting disciplinary practices, if you're doing restorative circles or restorative justice work, that requires so much vulnerability, right? To be able to confront the person you harmed or the person who harmed you and be able to say like, this is how this impacted me. And this is how we need to figure out how to be back in relationship with each other. That requires so much vulnerability. So starting to practice that and model that with our students really goes a long way. I would also what's paired with that vulnerability is accountability. Mm-hmm. So in your sphere of influence, how can I demonstrate how I'm being held accountable and how I'm holding you accountable within this classroom space? And it doesn't necessarily have to be just like disciplinary stuff, right? It doesn't have to necessarily be like just grading, like thinking about what are some other systems within your classroom to let people know this is how we care for each other.
Right.
Like this is how we engage with each other. Mm-hmm. I work with teachers to create rules of engagement, for example, and they can call it whatever they want. Usually I say something like guidelines or like whatever.
Right. Whatever language works for you. Right. Yeah,
exactly. So it could be things like we don't talk over people. And if we do, then there may be something in response to like you don't get to necessarily talk this round. So I have some folks that have, you ever had talking pieces? You have to have the talking piece in order to share. Yeah. And so if you for some reason talk without the talking piece, then when it comes back around, like you got to get skipped. Like it doesn't have to be anything big, like you got to go to the office, like whatever is built into your system. So thinking about what those guidelines will be, I encourage teachers to create those guidelines with your students. Like that first 2 or 3 days, take like max 2 class periods to really come up with that, or have a framework and students can edit it and they can come up with the consequence, right? So if you have something like extra recess time or TV time or whatever it might be, then a consequence is, if you violate this, then you don't get that extra reading time, or you don't get that extra whatever time. And then when students begin to violate throughout the school year, you're like, well, looks like you're not gonna have TV time. They're like, what? How is it? Look, we agreed to this. You came up with this. Oh, yeah, you're right. And so they have a bit more buy-in, and they also recognize students, not just students, adults, everybody tends to do a little bit better when they understand what the potential consequences are, as well as the potential rewards, and they can adjust themselves in a bit better way. So really thinking about what do I have control over? How might I be able to shift my classroom practices? And then start to figure out what does it look like to build a coalition from there, to start thinking about how might this be a practice within our building, to rethink what works and what doesn't work. Because teachers rarely, and not many schools, are teachers able to work with each other like in easy ways, right? And so there may be a teacher that's really doing some really dynamic work within their classroom and classroom engagement or behavior management, but no other teacher gets to see that. Thinking about if we're going to start leveling this up, how do we work within our building, our principal, whatever, for us to be able to model some of the work from other teachers, because they don't get to be seen except from the students in their classroom.
Right. And that happens all the time. And it's not just about the content that we're teaching. It's about the relationships that we're fostering. Absolutely. I appreciate you sort of bringing that piece to the conversation. I always like to close the program, the conversation, typically with sort of a high lob. There's somebody out there sort of in the hinterland, they're hearing this and they want to talk about how it gets started. But I'm going to shift this time because I want to sort of follow up on, our final concept here around creating the starting of creating that sort of brave space in your classroom by asking the question that I assume that folks would be thinking about. So let's assume that I do this and it's wildly successful, because we know that if folks put that time and effort in it, it certainly can be and have that ripple effect, hopefully throughout my school. How does this work translate in your experience? And I realize this is a big, giant, broad question, but how does it translate back into an individual child or community's experience? So what I'm trying to get at is we can do these amazing things in schools, and we do all the time. There is amazing work happening across the country, around the world in schools. Not all of them, but there are just really amazing things. And yet sometimes that amazing work gets lost when that individual child goes home or goes back into their community, into their neighborhood. It happens all the time in every setting that we can imagine. So how can a teacher creating a brave space sort of push the brave aspects of that space into the rest of that child's life? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I would challenge that it actually gets lost.
Yeah.
Because many of us can think about that one teacher from second grade or that one teacher, like we're adults and we remember.
Oh, right? Fondly, right?
Yeah.
It's very tangible to us. Yes.
Absolutely. So I would challenge that it actually gets lost. Now, there may not be a system in place that it's able to be implemented smoothly the way it is in the classroom, but the criteria or the essence is still there. What I like to tell teachers, and also what I believe as a parent is I'm not raising a child, I'm shaping an adult.
Right.
And so if we're believing that we are shaping adults, then we're also sharing with them, these are tools for you to use for your life, exactly. Right? So what does it mean to not interrupt people when they're talking? Because that's a practice you should use, like regardless, because essentially what you're saying is when you interrupt people is what I have to say is more important than whatever you have to say. What would that mean in a corporate space when you're in a position of power and you always are giving that energy, y'all? Practicing that in the classroom is really important. To believe that people are coming to this conversation with positive intent, even if they say something harmful, and letting them know, hey, that thing hurt. And they don't shift. Like if they're like, who cares? Okay, now you know who they are.
Right.
There's a good chance they're like, oh, I didn't know. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Yeah. Now let's think about what does it mean for us to be in relationship, knowing now what is hurtful, and you're now working to not do that anymore. What does it mean for us to continue to engage? To practice that in the classroom is something you'll need forever. Yeah. But saying that as an educator, like this isn't just for our classroom. I'm preparing you for the world. And whether I'm working with corporate clients or K-12 or whatever, I tell my teachers, y'all are my favorite people to work with because you are literally shaping the future. Yep. Our children are spending most of their childhood with you. Yep. And so really thinking about and reminding teachers of their power is so important. And also recognizing what is in their sphere of control. We can't necessarily control parents. Yep. We can't control the communities that they're coming from or going to. And so I would challenge us to not feel like put that burden on ourselves. And instead, we really deeply invest in the student and help them recognize there are multiple ways in which you can apply the stuff that we're talking about today. And think about how much you incorporate that in curriculum, how much you incorporate that in the activity, to think about how we can use our brave space tactics or our classroom guidelines, whatever it might be, in other areas. When you're on your football team, when you're working in your Girl Scout troop or whatever, like how might you be able to use this? And like, oh, I could see, or even when you're engaging with your parent, right? What does it mean to like believe that your parent is coming to this conversation or this disciplinary action with positive intent, because you're like, okay, what are they trying to do here? Yeah. Okay, they're trying to help me not be a slob, which is why I have to keep my room clean. Like you having that in your mind and helping them think through that, I think helps prepare the students with the hope that they will, that same lesson that we remember fondly of that favorite teacher we had in first, second, third grade, that they will also remember that fondly and take that with them outside the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you are 100% correct. Certainly my experience, and think back about those folks that had such a powerful impact on my life. And it is lifelong. Those impacts are almost always lifelong. So, thank you so much, Melissa, for joining us today, taking time out of your day, share your story. Again, I certainly appreciate that so very much, and for sharing your work and the work that you're doing in and around our communities and being on the program today. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Enjoyed being here.
Absolutely. Thank you.